There are thresholds in your life that don't look like thresholds at all. They are not grand, arched doorways, or clearly marked finish lines. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, shrouded in the mundane hum of a Tuesday, or in the artificial twilight of an office after everyone else has gone home. You only recognize them in retrospect, as the moments the entire architecture of your life began to shift on its foundation. For me, that threshold was a question, whispered across the gulf of two empty desks under the tired, flickering gaze of a fluorescent light. It was a question that had no right to hold the weight it did, but in the silent, echoing space of that evening, it became a fulcrum upon which my entire world was about to pivot. I had been living in a carefully constructed building of my own design for years, a place of quiet observation and emotional containment. I was the curator of my own solitude, and the most precious artifact in my collection was my friendship with Ethan. That night, he handed me a key to a door I never even knew existed, and my only choice was whether or not to turn the lock. The moment itself was simple. I was packing my messenger bag, the familiar ritual of sliding my laptop into its neoprene sleeve, coiling the charging cable into a neat circle, dropping my keys into the front pocket where they made a soft, muffled clink. The office was a ghost town, a skeletal landscape of dark monitors and empty chairs. Only our two workstations remained illuminated, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and merged on the industrial gray carpet. It was just after 10 post-meridian, the end of another marathon session pushing the new client interface toward its launch deadline. My body ached with a familiar, sedentary weariness, a dull throb in my lower back, and a sandy, gritty feeling behind my eyes. I was thinking of my apartment, of the blessed silence, of the glass of water I would drink while standing in the cool, dark kitchen. You heading out? Ethan's voice was soft, frayed at the edges from exhaustion. He hadn't moved. He was still sitting in his chair, staring at his own dark screen, his hands resting on his keyboard as if he'd forgotten they were there. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. Yeah, I'm seeing code in my sleep. Any later, and I'll start dreaming in hexadecimal. A small, breathy laugh escaped him. It wasn't his usual laugh, the one that boomed and filled a room with genuine mirth. This was a hollowed-out version of it, a ghost of a sound. He finally turned his head, and in the stark overhead light, I could see the deep lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He looked lost, adrift in the vast, empty ocean of the office. For months, he had looked like this. Ever since Sarah. Ever since his world had been unceremoniously dismantled, leaving him to sort through the wreckage alone. Right? He said, his voice barely a murmur. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. His gaze was strangely intense, searching. It made the air between us crackle, thicken. A current passed through the stillness, a silent communication that went far beyond our simple words. It was a look I had seen before in fragments, but never this sustained, this raw. It was the look of someone standing on a precipice, and for a terrifying, exhilarating moment, I felt like he was asking me to jump with him. I slung my bag over my shoulder. The weight of it was a familiar comfort, an anchor to the routine I was so desperate to return to. You should get out of here too, man. It's a wrap. We did good work today. He didn't answer. He just kept looking at me, his brown eyes holding a universe of unspoken things. I could see confusion in them, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness that resonated with a hidden frequency inside my own chest. It was a loneliness I recognized because I had lived with my own version of it for years. But while mine was a quiet, cultivated garden, his was a wildfire, raging and uncontrolled. I took a step toward the exit, my sneakers silent on the floor. Night, Ethan. That was when the threshold appeared. Leo, he said, his voice stopping me more effectively than a physical barrier. I turned back. He was still sitting, but he had shifted, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. The posture of a supplicant. The posture of a man about to confess something. The silence stretched, pulled taut like a string on a cello, vibrating with a note I couldn't quite name but felt in my bones. Then came the question. Are you really going home alone? It hung in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. It was a simple question with a complex, unspoken payload. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking for something else entirely. He was asking for refuge. He was asking for permission. He was, in his own fumbling, indirect way, asking for me. And in that moment, the quiet, orderly museum of my life, with its carefully labeled exhibits and velvet ropes, felt like it was about to be hit by a tidal wave. My heart, that traitorous organ, began a frantic, hammering rhythm against my ribs, a wild drumbeat heralding a monumental change in the weather. To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand the 4 years that preceded it. You have to understand the geography of our friendship, the borders we had tacitly drawn and respected. I met Ethan during my second week at OptiSync Solutions. I was a junior graphic designer, fresh out of art school, utterly lost in the corporate labyrinth of beige cubicles and impenetrable acronyms. I was quiet, observant, more comfortable with the silent language of color palettes and kerning than with the loud, performative chatter of the break room. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of meetings, my contributions offered in hushed tones, my presence easily overlooked. Then Ethan arrived, not like a ghost, but like a sudden, brilliant burst of sunlight. He was a software engineer, transferred from the Chicago branch, and he carried with him an energy that seemed fundamentally at odds with the sterile environment of our office. He laughed loudly and often. He talked to everyone, from the senior partners to the cleaning crew, with the same easy, unpretentious warmth. He had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, his focus absolute and his interest genuine. He was, in every conceivable way, my opposite. Our first real interaction was over a malfunctioning coffee machine. I had been pressing the button for a medium roast, only to receive a cup of lukewarm, vaguely brown water. I was staring at the pathetic result with quiet resignation when he came up behind me. "Don't drink that," he said, his voice full of amusement. "Unless you're trying to punish yourself for something. That thing's been serving up sad bean water all morning." He leaned past me, his arm brushing mine. A casual, insignificant touch that sent a jolt of electricity straight through my system. He opened a small panel, fiddled with a tube, and tapped the side of the machine with the practiced confidence of a man who understood how things worked. "Try it now." I did, and a stream of dark, fragrant coffee filled my cup. "You're a magician," I said, the words coming out softer than I'd intended. He grinned, a wide, dazzling thing that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Just a guy who can't function without caffeine. I'm Ethan, by the way. I don't think we've officially met." "Leo," I replied, and I felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. From that day forward, a friendship began to form, an unlikely bridge between his world of logical code and my world of aesthetic composition. It started with lunches. He would appear at my desk around noon, leaning against the flimsy cubicle wall. "Hungry? I'm dying for that Thai place on Elm." I, who had been planning to eat a sad desk salad while scrolling through design blogs, would find myself saying yes every single time. Our conversations were easy, flowing. He was fascinated by my work as a photographer outside the office, asking endless questions about f-stops and composition, listening with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time, truly seen. I learned about his life in fragments, his childhood in Wisconsin, his passion for cycling, his long-distance relationship with his high school sweetheart, Sarah. He became a fixture in my life, a bright, consistent star in my otherwise muted sky. I, in turn, became his confidant, the quiet harbor where he could vent about buggy code or impossible deadlines. People in the office noticed our bond, but it was easily categorized. The outgoing engineer and the quiet artist. An odd but harmless pairing. What they didn't see, what I barely allowed myself to acknowledge, was the subtle shift happening inside of me. My admiration for his easy confidence was slowly, imperceptibly, deepening into something far more complicated. It was a quiet, secret alchemy, turning the lead of friendship into the gold of unspoken love. I began to see him through the lens of my photographer's eye. I noticed the way a stray beam of afternoon light would catch the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the way his brow would furrow in concentration, creating a perfect, worried line between his eyebrows. I memorized the map of freckles across the bridge of his nose, the exact curve of his smile when it was genuine. These were details I collected and stored away in the private gallery of my mind, images I would develop in the darkroom of my solitary thoughts. I was acutely aware of his physical presence, of the space he occupied next to me. If our hands brushed while reaching for a shared menu, the point of contact would burn for minutes afterward. If he clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of casual camaraderie, I would feel the weight of his hand long after he'd moved away. It was a sweet, painful ache, a love that could only exist in the hypothetical. He had Sarah. He was, as far as I knew, completely and utterly straight. Our friendship was a precious, delicate ecosystem, and my feelings were an invasive species that threatened to destroy it. So I built walls. I became a master of emotional containment. I learned to smile and nod when he talked about his future with Sarah, to offer advice, to be the perfect, supportive friend, all while a quiet storm raged within me. The love I felt for him was a ship I had built inside a bottle, intricate, beautiful, and hopelessly contained. There was no way to get it out without shattering the glass. And I valued the bottle, our friendship, far too much to ever risk that. I accepted my role as the quiet observer, the platonic constant in his life. It was enough. It had to be. For 3.5 years, it was. The dynamic was stable, the borders clearly defined. We were Leo and Ethan, a single, indivisible unit in the office social structure. He was the sun, and I was the planet that quietly orbited him, content with the warmth and light, never daring to ask for more. I watched him navigate his life, the triumphs at work, the weekend cycling trips, the annual vacations with Sarah. I was the reliable friend, the one who would listen, the one who was always just there. My own life continued on its parallel track, filled with my photography, my quiet routines, my small circle of other friends. But the gravitational center of my emotional world had shifted. It was, and always had been, him. I had resigned myself to this truth, accepted it as a permanent feature of my internal landscape. Then, the landscape buckled. The catalyst arrived on a rainy Monday in April. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, creeping dread. Ethan had been off for a few days, using vacation time to help Sarah move into a new apartment they had finally chosen together in the city. He was supposed to come back glowing, full of stories about misplaced furniture and celebratory takeout. Instead, he walked into the office looking like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His usual vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, static silence. He didn't make his usual rounds to say hello. He went straight to his desk, sat down, and stared at his screen without turning it on. I waited, giving him space, my own anxiety a low hum beneath the surface of my work. At lunch, I walked over to his desk. "Hey," I said softly. "Thai place." He looked up at me, and his eyes were shattered. They were red-rimmed and unfocused, as if he were looking at me from a great distance, from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "Not today, Leo," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not. I can't. Is everything okay?" The question felt stupid, inadequate. Clearly, nothing was okay. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. He scrubbed a hand over his face, and when he spoke again, his voice broke. She ended it. While we were unpacking the U-Haul, said she couldn't do it. Couldn't see a future. He let out a choked, desperate sound that was half laugh, half sob. Perfect timing, right? The words hit me with a strange, bifurcated force. A part of me, the selfish, hidden part one was ashamed of, felt a flicker of something monstrously like hope. It was a tiny, ugly spark that I immediately tried to extinguish. The dominant part of me, the friend, felt nothing but a profound, gut-wrenching ache for his pain. To see him this broken, this utterly devastated, was like watching a grand cathedral crumble into dust. His ebullience had been a source of energy for me for so long. To see it extinguished was to feel the world grow colder and darker. "Ethan," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I'm so sorry." I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture felt too large, too fraught with the potential for misinterpretation. The old boundaries, which had once felt so restrictive, now felt like the only thing keeping me from falling apart myself. He just nodded, staring at his blank monitor. "Yeah, me too." That day marked the shift. The architecture of our friendship, so stable for so long, began to groan under a new and unfamiliar stress. The extroverted, confident Ethan I knew receded, replaced by a quiet, wounded man who seemed to shrink within himself. He became an island in the bustling office, his laughter gone, his light dimmed. He stopped going out for team drinks. He ate lunch at his desk. When he ate it all, he withdrew from everyone. Except me. In his isolation, he paradoxically drew closer to me. It was as if, in the wreckage of his life, I was the one piece of solid ground he could find. Our conversations changed. They were no longer about buggy code or funny anecdotes. He would talk, in quiet, halting sentences, about Sarah, about the future he had so meticulously planned, now a blueprint for a house that would never be built. He talked about the crushing silence of his apartment, a space that was supposed to be theirs, now just a large, empty box full of his own echoes. I listened. I didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. I just listened, providing a space for his grief to exist without judgment. I became his anchor in a churning sea of loss. The late nights at the office began a few weeks later. The launch was a convenient excuse, a socially acceptable reason to bury ourselves in work and avoid the emptiness that waited at home. For me, it was a continuation of my usual habits. For Ethan, it was a new form of escape. We would work for hours in comfortable silence, the click-clack of our keyboards a strange kind of conversation. The office, once a symbol of corporate monotony, became our sanctuary, a neutral territory where the ghosts of his past and the hopes for my future couldn't quite reach us. And that was when the ritual began. It started innocently enough. The first night we stayed past midnight. We packed up our bags in exhausted synchronicity. As we walked to the elevators, he'd hesitated. "My train doesn't run for another hour," he'd said, looking at the floor. "And my place it's too quiet. Do you mind if I don't know, just crash on your couch for a bit before I head home?" My apartment was in the opposite direction of his train station. It made no logical sense. But his request wasn't about logic. It was about seeking asylum from his own life. My heart hammered in my chest. It was a breach of protocol, a blurring of the lines we had so carefully maintained. But looking at his exhausted, pleading face, I couldn't say no. "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yeah, no problem." That first night was a study in excruciating tension for me. He walked into my apartment, a space that was so intimately mine, a physical extension of my own mind. He looked around at the photographs on my walls, the stacks of books, the carefully curated clutter. "This is nice," he murmured. "It feels calm." He sank onto my gray sectional sofa as if his bones were made of lead, and within minutes, the rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the room. He had fallen asleep, fully clothed, without even a pretense of waiting for his train. I stood in the middle of my living room for a long time, just watching him. The city lights from my large window cast a soft glow on his face, smoothing out the lines of pain and exhaustion. He looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go to him, to cover him with a blanket, to brush the stray lock of hair off his forehead. But I was paralyzed by the fear of what such a gesture would mean. It felt like a line I was not allowed to cross. So I did nothing. I retreated to my bedroom, closed the door, and lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of him breathing in my living room, a sound that was both a profound comfort and an exquisite form of torture. He was closer to me than ever before, and yet the distance felt immeasurable. He was gone before I woke up, a text message the only evidence he had been there at all. "Thanks for last night. I owe you." But it wasn't a one-time occurrence. It became our new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, We would leave the office together, and the excuse became thinner, more transparent, until it was gone altogether. He no longer mentioned the train schedule. He would just look at me as we packed our bags, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod. The ritual evolved, slowly, tentatively. The second or third time, I worked up the courage to leave a blanket and a pillow on the couch before I went to bed. The next morning, I found the blanket folded neatly, a silent thank you. A week after that, I found him shivering in his sleep, the thin throw I'd left him clearly not enough. My internal debate was a silent, frantic war. The fear of overstepping battled with the simple, human desire to offer comfort. The desire to comfort one. I retrieved the thick duvet from my own bed, and with my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears, I gently draped it over him. His breathing hitched for a moment, and he mumbled something incoherent, turning his face into the pillow. I froze, convinced I had woken him, that the spell would be broken. But he just settled deeper into sleep, into the warmth I had provided. I retreated, my entire body trembling with the adrenaline of that small, illicit act of care. The couch became our territory, a liminal space that was neither my bed nor his empty apartment. It was a shared island in the quiet hours of the night. We would get back to my place, and he would collapse onto it, and I would put on some ambient music or a documentary I knew neither of us would watch. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat in silence, the city a glittering tapestry outside my window, and the space between us began to shrink. One night, he patted the cushion next to him. "You don't have to hover, you know. Sit." So I sat. I kept a careful, respectful distance, a full cushion of air between us. But even that began to erode. He started to lean, just slightly, his shoulder brushing against mine. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was so hyper-aware of the point of contact, the warmth of his body seeping through the fabric of our shirts. It was an agony of wanting, of needing to lean back into the touch, but being terrified of what it might imply. I forced myself to breathe, to act as if it were the most natural thing in the world, just two tired friends sharing a couch. But it wasn't natural, not for me. It was electric. Every night was a tightrope walk over a canyon of unspoken feelings. I was his sanctuary, his safe harbor, but I was also a man drowning in my love for him. I was terrified that at any moment, the mask of the supportive friend would slip, and he would see the desperate longing underneath. I was terrified he would get better, that his grief would subside, and he would no longer need me or my couch. The thought was a constant, dull ache in my chest. I was profiting from his pain, and the guilt was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, the selfish part of me, the part that had lived in darkness for so long, clung to these stolen moments of closeness, these fragments of a life I had never believed I could have. The physical boundary, once so rigid, became fluid, permeable. One evening, we were sitting side by side, sharing the duvet, watching an old black-and-white film. He was exhausted, his head nodding with sleep. Without a word, he let his head fall and rest on my shoulder. It was a dead weight, a gesture of complete and utter trust. My breath caught in my throat. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, feel the soft tickle of his hair against my neck. I sat there, ramrod straight, for what felt like an eternity, my muscles screaming in protest, afraid that the slightest movement would break the spell. His breathing deepened, and I knew he was asleep. Cautiously, I allowed myself to relax, to lean my own head against his. We sat like that for over an hour, two broken figures propping each other up, the silent film flickering on the screen, illuminating our strange, fragile tableau. These moments were a language of their own, a conversation happening in the realm of touch and proximity. A hand brushing a knee, feet tangling together under the blanket. The unconscious way he would shift closer to me in his sleep. I became a scholar of this new language, dissecting every gesture, searching for intent, for meaning. Was this just the desperate clinging of a lonely, grieving man to any available warmth? Or was it something more? Was it possible that in the rubble of his old life, he was discovering something new? Something about himself? About us? The ambiguity was a form of exquisite torture. It gave me everything and nothing all at once. It filled my quiet apartment with a presence I craved, but it also filled my heart with a hope so fierce and terrifying that I could barely contain it. I was living on a knife's edge, balanced precariously between the heaven of his closeness and the hell of my own uncertainty. I was so lost in the analysis of these subtleties, so accustomed to the rhythm of our ritual, that I almost didn't recognize the moment the final wall was about to come down. It was a Thursday night. The project was finally, mercifully, complete. We had launched the interface. There were celebratory drinks at a bar near the office, an event filled with loud music and forced cheerfulness. I watched Ethan from across the room. He was trying. He was smiling, accepting congratulations, playing the part of the old Ethan. But his eyes were distant, and he kept glancing over at me, a silent, tethering look. We lasted an hour before we both made our excuses and slipped out into the cool night air. We didn't even speak. It was an unspoken assumption that we were going back to my place. The walk to the subway, the ride on the nearly empty train, the walk to my apartment. It was all done in a comfortable, familiar silence. But something felt different tonight. The air was charged, humming with a new kind of tension. The project was over. The primary excuse for our shared exhaustion was gone. The foundation of our ritual had been removed, and I didn't know what, if anything, would remain. Back in my apartment, the routine continued. He dropped his bag by the door and sank onto the couch. I turned on the television, keeping the volume low. I sat down beside him, leaving the customary cushion of space between us. He immediately closed the gap, shifting over until his thigh was pressed firmly against mine. He took the remote from my hand, his fingers brushing mine, and turned the television off. The silence that descended was not the comfortable, easy silence of our previous nights. It was heavy, active, full of unspoken words. The only sound was the distant sigh of city traffic and the frantic, riotous drumming of my own heart. I stared at the blank screen, my entire being focused on the line of warmth that ran from my hip to my knee, the solid, grounding pressure of his body next to mine. "Leo," he said, his voice low and raspy. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I was afraid of what I would see in his eyes, afraid of what he would see in mine. "Yeah." My voice was a thin, reedy thing. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I could feel him watching me, his gaze a physical weight on the side of my face. I felt stripped bare, exposed. The careful walls I had built around my heart felt like they were dissolving into dust. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" I managed, still staring at the dark reflection of the room on the TV screen. "For all of this," he whispered. "For letting me be here. For not asking questions. For just being here." "Of course," I said. It was all I could trust myself to say. He shifted, turning his body more fully toward me. I felt compelled to turn, too. I finally met his gaze. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it was something new, something raw and vulnerable and intensely focused. It was the same look from the office, the one that had felt like a precipice, but now we were standing even closer to the edge. The space between us was no longer a gulf. It was a hairline crack, a breath of air. "I don't think I would have made it through the last few months without you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "You're stronger than you think," I replied, the words feeling like a deflection, a retreat to the safe role of supportive friend. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "No, not really. I've just been borrowing your strength." He held my gaze, and the world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between our faces. The air grew thin, hard to breathe. I could see the pulse beating in his throat. I could feel his breath on my skin. This was it. This was the moment where the tightrope walker either reaches the other side or plummets into the abyss. I was about to speak, to say something safe, to shatter the intensity of the moment and retreat to familiar ground. I was about to stand up, to make an excuse about being tired, to leave him on the couch and flee to the safety of my bedroom, just as I had done so many times before. It was my conditioned response, my self-preservation instinct kicking in. My muscles tensed, preparing for the flight. Wait. His voice was a barely audible plea, but it rooted me to the spot. His hand came up, not to touch me, but just to hover in the space between us, a gesture of hesitation, of asking. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of fear and desire. I saw my own feelings reflected there, and the recognition stole the air from my lungs. He swallowed, the sound loud in the silent room. Leo, he began, his voice trembling slightly. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question was a detonation. It shattered the glass bottle, and the ship I had built with such painstaking care was suddenly, terrifyingly free, sailing out onto a vast, unknown ocean. All the air rushed out of me. The years of quiet longing, of hopeless pining, of carefully managed friendship, all crested into this single, heart-stopping moment. He was asking. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking for permission to cross the final, most sacred boundary. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. My own fear was a cold, metallic taste in my mouth. Fear that this was a mistake. Fear that he was just lost and confused. Fear that this would break him or break us in a way that could never be repaired. But beneath the fear was a current of pure, undiluted joy, so powerful it threatened to pull me under. He saw it. He saw the truth in me. He was seeing it, and he wasn't running away. I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. So I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. His eyes fluttered shut, a look of profound relief passing over his face. He leaned in, slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway, and his lips touched mine. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a confession. It was soft and hesitant and unbelievably gentle. It was the taste of salt from unshed tears and the faint, lingering sweetness of the coffee we'd had hours earlier. It was the culmination of 4 years of unspoken conversations, of shared lunches and late nights, of casual touches that were never casual at all. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock I never knew was there. In that single, breathtaking moment, the entire architecture of my world didn't just shift. It was rebuilt, from the foundation up, into something new and fragile and beautiful. I brought my hand up, my fingers trembling, and gently cupped his cheek. He sighed into the kiss, a sound of surrender, of coming home. And for the first time, the ship was out of the bottle, and the ocean ahead looked not like a terrifying abyss, but like an invitation. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and deceptive thing. There is a period of unsettling quiet, where the air is clean and the world seems scrubbed new, but the evidence of the chaos is everywhere, in the downed branches, the shifted landscapes. Our kiss was a storm of the quietest kind, but its aftermath was just as profound. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, a new reality had settled in the space between us. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other, our eyes trying to communicate the enormity of what had just happened. There were no words for it. In the end, it was he who broke the silence, but not with words. He simply lowered his head, resting his forehead against mine, and let out a long, shuddering breath. It was a sound of exhaustion, of relief, of profound, gut-wrenching uncertainty. I closed my eyes, just absorbing the feeling of his skin against mine, the solid, real presence of him. For a few perfect, suspended moments, it felt like a resolution. It felt like the beginning of an answer. But beginnings are rarely so clean. That night, he didn't sleep on the couch. After a long, silent moment, I stood up and, my heart hammering, held out my hand. He took it, his fingers lacing through mine with a natural, unthinking ease that made my soul ache. I led him to my bedroom. It was a silent, solemn procession. There was no seduction in it, no expectation. It was simply an acknowledgement that the couch was no longer the right place for him, that the boundary of my bedroom door, once so absolute, had been dissolved. He slept in my bed, on the side that had always been empty, and I lay awake beside him, listening to him breathe. We didn't touch again, a careful foot of space between us, but his presence was a loud, overwhelming symphony in the quiet of the room. I was terrified to move, terrified to sleep, terrified that if I closed my eyes, I would wake up to find it had all been a dream. The morning brought the chill. He woke before me, slipping out of bed with the stealth of a thief. I pretended to be asleep, listening to the soft sounds of him gathering his things from the living room. There was no shared coffee, no quiet morning conversation. When I finally heard the soft click of my front door closing, the silence he left behind was heavier, more desolate, than any silence I had ever known in that apartment. It was a silence full of questions and fear. At the office, the change was immediate and devastating. He avoided my eyes. He, who had been my constant companion, suddenly found urgent reasons to be at the other end of the building. He took his lunch with a group from marketing. He put on his headphones and stared at his screen with a ferocious intensity that was a clear and painful "do not disturb." The easy warmth between us was gone, replaced by a cold, awkward vacuum. The open channel of communication we had shared for years was now filled with static. It was a torment beyond anything I had ever experienced. The hope that had bloomed so fiercely in my chest just days before began to wither and die. I replayed the kiss, the question, the look in his eyes, over and over in my mind, searching for the moment I had misinterpreted everything. Had it just been a moment of grief-fueled madness? A desperate reach for comfort that he now profoundly regretted? Had I been nothing more than a port in a storm, a convenient body to cling to? And now that the worst of his personal tempest had passed, he was ashamed. The pain of it was a physical thing. It was a cold, heavy stone in my gut. I had risked everything. I had let him see me, truly see me, and his response was to flee. The friendship that I had guarded so preciously for years, the thing I had been so terrified of breaking, it seemed I had shattered it anyway. And for what? For one tentative, heartbreakingly gentle kiss. The irony was cruel. In trying so hard not to lose him, I had lost him completely. The silence from him was a judgment, a confirmation of my deepest fear, that I was not wanted, that I had been a fool. For a week, I lived in this new, cold reality. I went through the motions at work. I retreated into myself, becoming the ghost I had been before he'd arrived. I felt the pitying or curious glances of my coworkers, who had surely noticed the sudden, dramatic rift between us. The office, once our sanctuary, became a minefield of potential awkward encounters. Every time I saw him from a distance, my heart would leap with a pathetic, desperate hope, only to be crushed when he would deliberately turn and walk the other way. I knew I couldn't let it go on. The ambiguity, this time, was not a sweet torture. It was just torture. The not knowing was hollowing me out, leaving me more empty than I had been even in my most solitary days. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake. I needed the clean pain of a final ending, not the slow, agonizing death of 1,000 cuts. I needed to close the door he had so carelessly opened. I waited until a Friday evening, when the office had once again emptied out into the skeletal landscape I knew so well. I saw him packing his bag, moving with a haste that told me he was desperate to escape before I could intercept him. My own fear was a roaring in my ears, but the need for closure was stronger. I walked over to his desk, my steps feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. I stood before him, blocking his path. "Ethan," I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected, clear and steady in the quiet room. He flinched, not looking at me. He continued stuffing papers into his bag. "Hey, Leo. Got to run. I'm meeting." "No." I cut him off, the word sharp. "You're not. You're going to talk to me." He finally stopped, his hands frozen over his bag. He slowly, reluctantly, raised his head. His face was a mask of misery. He looked exhausted, haunted. The sight of his pain, even though he was the cause of my own, sent a pang of familiar sympathy through me. "There's nothing to talk about," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Nothing to talk about." My voice rose, tinged with a disbelief that bordered on hysteria. "You kissed me, Ethan. You came into my home, into my life, you stayed in my bed, and then you disappeared. You treat me like a stranger, like I have some kind of contagious disease. And you think there's nothing to talk about." He winced, the words hitting him like physical blows. "Leo, please. Don't do this here. Here is the only place I can get you to stand still for 5 seconds." I shot back, my voice trembling now with the force of a week's worth of repressed hurt and confusion. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in the anger, to find the quiet, honest core of what I needed to say. "I'm not trying to attack you. I need to understand. I have been your friend for 4 years. I think I deserve more than being ghosted." He finally looked me in the eye. And what I saw there wasn't anger or disgust. It was fear, pure, absolute terror. He looked like a cornered animal. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You deserve more. You deserve so much better than this. Than me. Then talk to me." I pleaded, my voice softening. "Tell me what happened. If it was a mistake, just tell me. If you regret it, I need to hear you say it. It will hurt, but it will be better than this silence. This silence is killing me." He collapsed back into his chair, the fight going out of him completely. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The sound of his ragged breathing filled the space between us. I waited, my own anger dissolving into a familiar, painful ache of empathy. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke, his voice muffled by his hands. "It wasn't a mistake." The 3 words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I clung to them, my breath catching in my chest. He lifted his head, his face ravaged with conflict. "That's what scares me, Leo. It wasn't a mistake. It was the first thing that's felt real in." I don't even know how long he laughed, a bitter, broken sound. When Sarah left, my whole world fell apart. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I wanted, it just evaporated. And I was just lost, adrift. And you were there. You were this constant, solid, quiet thing in the middle of all the chaos. You were my anchor. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Coming to your apartment, being in that calm space you've created, it was the only time I felt like I could breathe. And being near you, I just started needing it. Like air. And I didn't understand it. I told myself it was just friendship. I told myself I was just grieving and lonely." He stood up and began to pace, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure agitation. "But it wasn't just that. The way I felt, sitting next to you on that couch, it was more than just comfort. It was something else. Something I've never felt before. And it terrified me, because it wasn't part of the plan. The life I had mapped out for myself. This wasn't in it. You weren't in it. Not like this." He stopped pacing and faced me, his expression one of raw, painful honesty. "So when I kissed you, it was like a confession. I was admitting it to myself as much as to you. And it felt right. It felt like coming home. And that scared me more than anything. Because what if I'm not the person I thought I was? What if I ruin this? What if I ruin you? You're the best person I know, Leo. The thought of hurting you, of messing this up because I'm a confused, broken mess. I couldn't bear it. So I ran. It was cowardly and it was cruel, and I am so sorry. All the anger, all the hurt, all the fear that had been churning inside me for a week simply evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of understanding so profound it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from the magnitude of what he felt, a feeling so new and powerful it threatened to rewrite his entire identity. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't want me. He was pushing me away because he wanted me so much it terrified him. I closed the distance between us, and this time, I was the one to initiate the touch. I placed my hands gently on his arms, forcing him to be still, to look at me. "You are a confused, broken mess," I said softly, and a flicker of pain crossed his face. I tightened my grip slightly. "And so am I. We all are, Ethan. That's what it means to be a person. You think I'm not scared? I have been in love with you for years. I have lived in terror of you ever finding out, because I was so sure it would destroy the one thing I couldn't bear to lose, your friendship. Every night you spent on my couch was a private slice of heaven and hell for me." His eyes widened, shock and wonder dawning in them. "Years?" he whispered. I nodded, a sad smile on my lips. "Years. So don't you dare talk to me about being scared. We're both standing on a precipice. The only difference is, I'm not afraid to jump. But I'm not going to jump alone. And I'm not going to stand here and watch you run away from the one thing that you yourself said feels real. I looked at him, my gaze unwavering. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be brave enough to stop running. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over and tracing paths down his cheeks. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He just stared at me, a man seeing a clear path forward for the first time in a long time. He closed his eyes, and a single, choked sob escaped him. And then he collapsed forward, his arms wrapping around me, his face buried in the crook of my neck. I held him tightly, my own arms circling his back, holding him up, just as he had held me up for years with his laughter and his light. We stood there for a long time, in the silent, empty office, two broken pieces finally fitting together. The conflict was over. The aftermath was over. This was not a resolution. It was a beginning, a real one. The conversation that followed our embrace in the office was not a grand, sweeping declaration of love. It was quiet, fragmented, and profoundly honest. We didn't go back to my apartment that night. Instead, we walked. We walked for hours through the deserted streets of the financial district, the tall, silent buildings standing like sentinels around us. We talked about everything and nothing. He spoke of the suffocating pressure he'd felt to follow a pre-written life script. The career, the marriage, the house, and the terrifying, liberating feeling of that script being torn to shreds. I spoke of my solitude, of the way my camera lens had become a barrier between myself and the world, a way to observe life without ever truly having to participate in it. We laid our fears out on the table, examining them under the cool, impartial glow of the streetlights. His fear of not knowing who he was anymore. My fear that his feelings were a temporary byproduct of his grief. His fear of hurting me. My fear of finally getting what I always wanted, only to discover it wasn't real. We were two cartographers, mapping out the treacherous, unfamiliar territory of our own hearts, and for the first time, sharing our findings. There were no easy answers. There was no sudden, magical certainty. There was only a shared commitment to navigate the uncertainty together. To be brave enough, as I had said, to stop running. When we finally parted ways near his train station in the cold, pre-dawn hours, it was with a new understanding. He reached out, not for a kiss, but to gently squeeze my hand. Tomorrow, he asked, the single word full of a new kind of promise. It wasn't a question about work. It was a question about us. Tomorrow, I confirmed, and the word felt solid, real, a foundation stone being laid. The days that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We were learning a new dance. At work, the awkwardness was replaced by a quiet, conspiratorial intimacy. A shared glance across a conference room held a novel's worth of meaning. A brief touch of hands as I passed him a file was a secret affirmation. Our coworkers, who had been walking on eggshells around our sudden schism, were visibly relieved by the return of our camaraderie, though they couldn't possibly understand the new depth and texture it had acquired. We were Leo and Ethan again, but the hyphen that connected our names now meant something entirely different. The ritual of the late nights returned, but it was transformed. He still came back to my apartment, but there was no pretext, no lingering ghost of his old life driving him there. He came because he wanted to be with me. The couch, once a space of agonizing ambiguity, became just a piece of furniture. We would sit on it, closer than ever before, his head often resting in my lap as I read, my fingers gently tracing patterns in his hair. The touch was no longer a question, but a statement. It was a new language we were becoming fluent in, a language of quiet, domestic affection. The first night he stayed over again after our talk, there was a moment of quiet, unspoken tension as the hour grew late. The old pattern dictated that I would go to my room and he would remain in the living room. We both felt the pull of that old habit, the gravitational force of our former boundaries. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I stood up, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought I was leaving him. I saw the flash of fear, the old wound. I simply held out my hand, just as I had on the night of the kiss. "Come on," I said softly. The relief that washed over his face was a beautiful thing to witness. He took my hand, and this time, when I led him to my bedroom, it felt different. It was not a solemn procession into unknown territory. It was a simple, natural act of two people going to bed. That night, the careful foot of space between us in the bed disappeared. In the darkness, he rolled over and wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me against him, his face nuzzling into my back. His breath was warm on my neck. My own body, so long accustomed to solitude, at first tensed in surprise, but then, slowly, miraculously, it relaxed. It yielded. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a feeling of rightness so absolute it felt like it had settled into my very bones. This was what it felt like to not be alone. I fell asleep in his arms, a deeper and more restful sleep than I had known in years. Our life together began to build, brick by quiet brick. A toothbrush of his appeared in the holder next to mine. A few of his shirts found their way into my closet, folded neatly next to my own. He started cooking for us on the weekends, filling my quiet, minimalist kitchen with the scent of garlic and basil and the sound of his happy, off-key humming. He brought his bicycle over, parking it in the hallway, a tangible, permanent-looking fixture. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, was slowly, beautifully, becoming a home for two. It was a process of gentle invasion, a colonization I welcomed with an open heart. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he needed a full 10 minutes of silence and 2 cups of coffee before he was capable of human conversation in the morning. He learned that I needed to spend hours wandering the city with my camera on a Sunday afternoon to feel recharged, to recalibrate my own soul. He would wait for me, and when I returned, he would look through my photos with that same intense, genuine interest he'd shown from the very beginning, his praise a quiet balm to my artist's insecurities. We were creating a new kind of silence together, one that wasn't empty, but full. It was full of understanding, of acceptance, of the profound comfort of knowing you could be entirely yourself with another person and it would be enough. There were still moments of fear, of course, moments of insecurity that would bubble up from the depths. One evening, months into our new life, he was unusually quiet. I felt a familiar pang of anxiety, the ghost of his old withdrawal. I found him staring out the window, a pensive, worried look on his face. "What is it?" I asked, coming to stand behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist. He sighed, leaning back into me. "I was just thinking about Sarah," he said. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. He must have felt me tense up, because he quickly added, "Not like that. Not missing her. I was just thinking how strange it is. I spent so many years trying to build a life with her, trying to force the pieces to fit. It was all effort. It was all about planning and trying and pushing. It was exhausting." He turned in my arms to face me, his hands coming up to cup my face. His gaze was soft, full of a quiet wonder. "And then there's this. With you. It's not like that at all. It's not about trying. It's just breathing. It's the easiest, most natural thing I've ever known. And sometimes it scares me, how easy it is. It feels too good to be true. Like I don't deserve something this peaceful." I leaned in and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss full of all the reassurance I couldn't put into words. "We both deserve it," I murmured against his lips. We waited long enough. And in that moment, I knew we had truly arrived. We had navigated the storm, survived the aftermath, and found our way to a new shore. The love that had once been a ship in a bottle was now a vessel carrying us both, sailing on a calm and steady sea. The threshold I had crossed on that long-ago night in the office wasn't a doorway into a strange new land. It was a doorway home. It was the entrance to a room I hadn't even known my soul was missing, a room filled with light and quiet and the profound peace of a shared life. We had found our sanctuary not in a place, but in each other, and we began to heal and to build and to live in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, at last, to create together.